Hey there! So I was looking through different dress patterns online and I found this one that I really liked, and I have some leftover fabric that I wanted to try out, and so I'm going to try and sew that today. So I have 42 pages of this pattern to put together, so it's probably going to take a little while. Let's get started. Anyway, I'm going to figure out my size and I'm going to cut out the pattern pieces for that. I chose to use this golden fabric and then two different red fabrics that are sort of velvety. This one's more of a silky material. I chose out the different parts of the dress that are going to be the different colors. Make sure if you have a piece like this that is mirrored, make sure you cut out one that is reversed like this. I've also cut out my interfacing to match. If you have a fabric like this, make sure you put it on either the lowest setting you have or the silk setting, because you don't want to melt it or burn a hole through it. Now that I've got all the pieces cut out and interfaced, and also most of them ironed, I'm going to start on the first step. Since the bodice and the bodice lining are made exactly the same, I'm going to just do them at the same time. We're going to start with piece number 1, which is the bodice front, which I've marked off the notches. I'm going to stay stitch between the pins here on all 4 pieces, 2 of which are the lining, which have been interfaced. Stay stitching is just a stitch close, very close to the edge, that adds support to the section which you are sewing it. Make sure to do a test run with your fabric just to make sure that the tension is right on your machine and that all your settings are good for the type of fabric that you've chosen. And so I've chosen to use this shade of red compared to this. I know it's difficult to see, this one's a little bit more orange and I like this one better. But I'm only using this one for visible seams, and for like stay stitching and stuff like that, I'm just going to use my white thread that's already in my machine, and then once I'm doing like top stitching or anything that might show through, I'm going to use this. I also have this gold thread for the collar areas. The next step is to pin the bodice side front to the bodice front, right sides together. I also have some pinking shears, which I'm going to use to finish all my edges. Since I was getting frustrated with my machine, I just went ahead and did my lining with a regular white polyester thread, and it worked perfectly fine because, I don't know, the red thread was just not working at all. One thing that I find a bit confusing is why they got us to do this stay stitching here when we're just going to sew next to it, right? So we're a seam, which is right here where my thumb is, and then clip, and I like to trim the seam allowance, so it basically just cuts off the stay stitching anyway. Next, we're going to stitch bodice back, piece 7, 2 bodice front sections at sides. Since this fabric that I'm using isn't as thick as this and isn't as structured, I think I'm going to cut out iron on the interfacing, and after I sew this, I'm going to iron it on to just this back piece to give it a bit more structure. Next, we're moving on to the collar for view A. So we're going to reinforce collar back, which is piece 10, through a small circle as shown, clip to small circles. Just like the bodice, we are doing this for the lining and the outer fabric. You want them? Yeah. I personally don't like marking with like pens or even clipping into my fabric just in case. So I've marked with pins where the dots are, like they have there where those dots are. I feel like a pharaoh or some like fancy rich person with my gold hat on, my golden hair. Next, we're gonna pin piece 11 to the collar back. So this big piece that we were just working on, and we're gonna sew between these 2 points. Now we're gonna turn in seam allowance between small circles as shown. This video is sponsored by kale. Very tasty and good for you. After sewing both of the collar pieces right sides together, I turned it right side out and I understitched. I stitched on the side that had the interfacing, see this side, and I stitched the raw edges down. I also found it quite difficult to do this in the corners, so I did the corners by hand and then continued sewing with my machine in the straight areas. This is the front that will be seen, and this has been understitched. So just along here, basting. And then I also hand stitched with a ladder stitch all the way from the middle section to these edge pieces of the collar. Before I changed my thread back to the red thread, I sewed these strap pieces, number 14. I folded them in half right sides together and sewed with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to turn them inside out and iron them down. It's funny because I had just enough bobbin thread, see I just have the top thread here, just enough bobbin thread to sew these last 2 pieces. Phew. Now I'm going to baste the collar to the outer fabric of the bodice. I'm going to use my iron and press this lower edge up 5/8 of an inch for the seam allowance. You're supposed to trim it to 3/8, but I'm going to leave it just in case. So basically, I'm going to have my lining on the outside of this piece right here. So this has my collar on it and my straps. I'm going to pin that all the way around with right sides together, and then I'm going to sew from the bottom here up over, stopping so that there's a space for the straps that are sewn in the back. They're going to come around to the front, and I'm going to sew them in after. That's what the next step is here. But you're going to leave a space, and then sew the armholes in the back, armholes, stop, and then sew the front like that. The instructions for the bodice are really limited, especially here at the end, because basically once you're done sewing the lining to the bodice, it just tells you to understitch. They don't explain like how you're supposed to turn it right side out and how you're supposed to finish the edges properly. So I haven't ironed or understitched this, but I turned it inside out just so I could try it on and size the straps properly. And also I was making sure that the waist was big enough because there's going to be buttons on the front, so this has to overlap. And it was just the right size, so that's good. So now I'm going to turn it back the wrong sides out and sew the straps in. Now that everything has been understitched, like here by hand, starting on this edge all the way up around the arms, all the way to the other side, I also did some top stitching by hand just to keep these parts down, leaving the arm flaps, and then going along the back by hand. The bodice is complete except for the buttons, which we'll be putting in later. So I'm going to move on to the skirt. After hand sewing for probably 3 days, my fingers have been destroyed because I don't have a thimble, so I use these band-aids to cover up. And now I can finally shed my cocoon because I'm going back to using my sewing machine. We're going to stay stitch the upper edge of each piece 16 section. There should be 4 of these. Next, we're going to sew piece 15 to piece 16, pressing the seam upwards. Choose your 2 best pieces from these ones because they're going to be on the front with this piece. When sewing these pieces together, you need to make sure that you're sewing the correct side So this is the top piece that's been sewn onto 16 here. So you want to make sure that you're sewing on this side where the notch lines up with 17. So 17 is going to go on top because we're sewing right sides together. Now that the front is sewn, we're going to stitch the remaining skirt side, front, and back sections to the skirt back, piece 18. Now we're going to stitch skirt front to skirt back at the sides. Here's a pointer for when you have two seams. I like to make sure that they're lined up first and then pin the rest of the fabric above and below it, just because you can trim off the excess from the top or the bottom, but if these aren't lined up, then it's going to look funny for your finished product. Next, we're going to take piece 19, the skirt facing, and we're going to pin it right sides to the skirt that we've just been working on. And then after that, we are going to understitch. When it says to finish the unnotched edge of the skirt facing, piece 19, means this side here, and you can either hem it, or you can use some pinking shears, like I've got here, or you can use your serger. It's all up to you. So we're gonna baste the top up here, and then we're gonna hem the bottom of the dress. Once you're all done your hemming, which was torture by the way, we are going to sew the skirt right sides to the outside layer of the bodice. So this is the lining, which is going to go on the inside. We pinned them right sides together, and we're just going to do a straight stitch all the way around, and then in the seam allowance we're going to stitch once again just to make sure that it's totally secure. Now we are going to iron the seam that we just stitched, iron it upwards, and then we are going to iron this down, and you can either top stitch, or if you want it to be more precise, you can do it by hand. Last step is to make buttonholes and sew the buttons onto your dress. I've marked my start and end point for this button here. So overall, I would say this was a success. Although I wouldn't wear this out in public all the time, it might be nice for like Christmas time celebrations if I want to be out there. Although this pattern was really good, it would have been better if I used a cotton material for everything. When I chose this fabric, I went off in my own direction, and then I had to take a lot of steps to fix that. But it turned out into something that not only does it fit me, but it's also pretty comfortable. Although I did have to alter some things, just like this where the buttons are. It's supposed to be more in the middle. I kind of actually like it on the side, personally. The material for the skirt that I used is kind of thin, so that's why I decided to make the underskirt, and I'm really glad that I did. And it's like all made out of secondhand material, like other than thread. So you can really make anything out of whatever you have. Overall, it's a good pattern. There's a few things that I would change about the wording. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you like my videos, and I'll see you in the next one.